The wind tearing through the dense Oregon woods had a mean streak, the kind that found its way through every stitch of clothing and bit straight into the bone. It was a cold that wasn't just felt. It was heard, a low, mournful howl that served as the forest's only language. For Marcus Thorne, it was a familiar song. A retired Navy SEAL, he had spent years operating in environments where the cold was a weapon used by the enemy, a silent adversary as dangerous as any bullet. Now, his battlefield was the sprawling wilderness behind his isolated cabin, and his only company was his K9 partner, Ren. Ren was a Belgian Malinois, a gift from a fellow soldier who had been killed in action. The dog was more than a pet. He was a living, breathing tether to a life Marcus often struggled to leave behind. Ren's fur was a tapestry of fawn and charcoal, his eyes holding an intelligence that seemed to understand the silence Marcus carried within him. They moved through the frosted undergrowth as a single unit, a ghost and his shadow. The mission today was simple. A long-range reconnaissance of a trap line Marcus had set days earlier. The SEAL in him never truly switched off. Every outing was an operation, planned and executed with precision, even if the objective was just fresh rabbit for the stew pot. The snow had begun to fall an hour ago, fat, lazy flakes that were quickly becoming a blinding curtain of white. Marcus pulled the collar of his heavy coat tighter, his gloved hand resting briefly on Ren's head. The dog's ears were flat against his skull, a sign of focus, not fear. They pushed deeper into the woods, and the only sound the soft crunch of their boots and paws on the accumulating powder. The light was beginning to fade, the already gray sky deepening to the color of bruised slate. He was about to signal a turn back when Ren stopped dead in his tracks. It wasn't the alert stance he used for deer or the rigid point he adopted for birds. This was different. Ren's entire body became a coiled spring, his head low, a low guttural whine vibrating from his chest. He took a few steps forward, then looked back at Marcus, his amber eyes pleading. Marcus felt a prickle of ice that had nothing to do with the weather run down his spine. The dog's behavior was a language Marcus had spent years learning, and this message was one of urgent distress. He gave a soft hand signal. Lead on. Ren surged forward, not with the exuberance of a run, but with a purposeful ground-eating trot. Marcus followed, his own senses now on high alert. He scanned the trees, the drifts of snow, looking for any sign of what had disturbed his partner. They crested a small ridge, and Ren stopped, his whine turning into a sharp, frantic bark. Below them, half buried in a drift at the base of a large Douglas fir, was what looked like a heap of discarded clothing. But as Marcus's trained eyes swept the scene, the heap resolved itself into the unmistakable shape of a person. A small person. His heart, a metronome he could usually control, skipped a beat. He and Ren scrambled down the slope, the snow pouring over the tops of his boots. As he got closer, the scene became a tableau of desperate tragedy. It was a boy, no more than 8 or 9 years old. He was curled into a tight ball, his thin jacket crusted with ice, his jeans soaked through. His face pressed against the snow was a terrifying shade of pale, almost blue in the fading light. Ren immediately went to work. He began to whine loudly, nudging the boy's still form with his nose, then licking his exposed cheek with a rough, frantic tongue. He was trying to wake him up, trying to call him back from wherever he had gone. Marcus dropped to his knees, the cold shock of the snow against his legs barely registering. He gently turned the boy over, brushing the snow from his face. The boy's lips were a faint purple, his skin cold as marble to the touch. He was so still. Marcus pressed 2 fingers to the boy's neck, his own breath held captive in his chest. For a terrifying second, there was nothing. Then, faint but undeniable, a weak, thready pulse fluttered beneath his fingertips. He was alive, but barely. He was in the final stages of hypothermia, a silent killer that was even now coaxing him into a permanent sleep. The SEAL's mind, forged in the crucible of chaos, immediately clicked into a familiar, life-saving protocol. The first objective was to stop the heat loss. He ripped off his heavy pack, his fingers working with practiced speed despite the cold. He pulled out his emergency bivvy, a sack of space-age material designed to reflect body heat. He unzipped his own heavy coat, the frigid air biting into his chest. Ignoring the cold, he gathered the boy into his arms, surprised by how light he was, and pulled him against his own body, zipping his massive coat around them both as best he could. He could feel the boy's shivering, or rather the lack of it. And the shivering had stopped, a terrifying sign that the body's core temperature was dropping, and it had given up its last defense. While he cocooned the boy, Ren was on guard. He stood over them, his body a shield against the wind, his eyes scanning the darkening woods for any threat. He wasn't just a dog, he was a sentry. For 10 minutes, Marcus held the boy, feeling the faint warmth of his own body slowly, incrementally, transferring to the small, frozen frame. He whispered to him, low, calm words, the same tone he used to steady a panicking teammate. "You're okay, kid. You're not alone. We got you." When he felt he had done all he could at the site, he knew he had to move. The shelter of his cabin was miles away, a distance that was now an insurmountable obstacle course through a blizzard. He couldn't carry the boy that far, not in this weather, not without risking both their lives. He had to make a split-second decision. He pulled the boy out from under his coat, wrapped him tightly in the thermal bivvy, and then looked at Ren. He pointed to the boy, then to the ground. "Guard," he commanded, his voice the same firm tone of authority he'd used 1,000 times before. Ren immediately lay down, curling his own warm body around the silver cocoon, pressing his furry head against the boy's shoulder. He understood. His mission was now to protect this vulnerable package at all costs. Marcus stood up, the wind screaming past him. He had minutes to get back to the cabin and return with a sled. Every second counted. He gave Ren one last look, a silent communication between partners, and then turned and ran. He ran not as a tired man in the woods, but as a SEAL with a man down. He ran with a singular, all-consuming focus, the burning in his lungs and the sting of the cold on his face, insignificant obstacles. He crashed through the undergrowth, his mind a map of the terrain, his legs pumping with a power born of desperation. He burst into his cabin, not even stopping to close the door, grabbing the lightweight rescue sled he kept for hauling firewood and game. He threw it over his shoulder and ran back out into the maw of the storm, retracing his steps in the snow, a frantic race against a clock that was quickly running out. The return journey felt 3 times as long. The adrenaline that had fueled his sprint to the cabin was beginning to wane, replaced by a deep, gnawing fatigue. The snow was falling even harder now, and his own outward tracks were beginning to fill, so making the path harder to follow. He relied on his internal compass and the distinctive shape of the trees he had mentally marked on his way out. Every minute that passed was a minute the boy was closer to the edge. He crested the final ridge, his breath coming in ragged gasps, and his heart lurched. For a horrible moment, he couldn't see them. The spot under the fir tree was just a deeper drift of white. Then he saw a movement. A fawn-colored head popped up, ears pricked forward. Ren had heard him coming long before he could see him. Marcus half ran, half slid down the slope. Ren was still curled protectively around the boy, who was utterly still. Marcus knelt, placing a hand on the bivvy. He could feel no warmth emanating from it. He tore it open. The boy's color was no better. If anything, the bluish tinge seemed more pronounced. But his chest was faintly rising and falling. He was still in the fight. Working with the precision of a medic, Marcus quickly but gently transferred the boy onto the sled. He wrapped him in every dry piece of clothing he had brought, a fleece jacket, a wool blanket, and then sealed him back in the thermal bivvy. He clipped the sled's harness to his own waist. "Let's go home, Wren," he said, his voice a low growl of determination. The journey back was a brutal, silent war. The sled, light as it was, became a dead weight in the deepening snow. The wind was a solid wall he had to push against. The cold was a living thing, clawing at his exposed face and hands. He lost feeling in his toes first, then his fingers. He didn't stop. He couldn't stop. He focused on putting one foot in front of the other. On the drag of the sled, a constant reminder of the precious cargo behind him. Wren ran alongside him, a silent, furry motor of encouragement, his presence a comfort in the white void. Finally, miraculously, the dark shape of his cabin emerged from the swirling snow. It looked like a beacon of salvation. He pulled the sled right up to the door, fumbled with the latch with numb hands, and pushed it open. A wave of warm, wood-scented air washed over them. He unhitched himself and dragged the sled inside, Wren following close at his heels, shaking snow from his coat. The cabin was his sanctuary, a single room with a wood-burning stove, a bed, a table, and shelves lined with his meager possessions. He locked the door behind them, shutting out the storm. The immediate danger of exposure was over, but the boy was far from safe. He had to rewarm him, but he had to do it carefully. Rapid rewarming of a severely hypothermic person could send cold blood from the extremities rushing to the heart, causing cardiac arrest. He knew the protocols. He lifted the boy from the sled, a fragile bundle in his arms, and laid him on the worn rug in front of the wood stove. He quickly stoked the fire, adding more logs until it was roaring with a fierce, comforting heat. He then carefully removed the boy's frozen clothes. The jeans were stiff as cardboard, the small sneakers frozen solid. The boy's skin was mottled and ice-cold to the touch. Marcus grabbed his own softest, warmest clothes, a thick thermal shirt and a pair of wool socks. He dressed the boy with the gentle hands of a father, a stark contrast to the calloused grip of a soldier. He pulled a heavy-down sleeping bag from his locker, unzipped it, and wrapped the boy in it, tucking it snugly around him. He placed him as close to the stove as was safe, the radiant heat beginning to slowly penetrate the layers of insulation. Wren, his mission of guarding complete, had not left the boy's side. He now lay with his head resting on the edge of the sleeping bag, his dark eyes fixed on the pale face. He would occasionally let out a soft whine, as if asking Marcus, "Is he going to be okay?" Marcus sat on the floor beside them, his back against a wooden chair. He was exhausted, his body screaming for rest, but he didn't dare take his eyes off the boy. He watched the slow, shallow rhythm of his breathing. He reached out and felt his forehead. It was still frighteningly cold. The minutes stretched into an hour. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire, the howl of the wind outside, and Wren's steady breathing. Marcus fought off the wave of fatigue, his mind churning with questions. Who was this kid? How had he ended up alone, miles from anywhere, in a blizzard? The woods stretched for dozens of miles in every direction. The nearest town was a 45-minute drive on a good day. There were no houses out here, no roads, just trees and mountains and cold. It was as if the forest had simply spit him out. He leaned forward, studying the boy's face more closely. He looked young, his features soft beneath a layer of grime and windburn. His hair was matted with snow and pine needles. There were scratches on his small hands. He saw no signs of a struggle, no tears in his clothes that would indicate an animal attack. He was simply lost. Abandoned. The thought struck Marcus with a force that had nothing to do with the cold. Abandoned. It was a word he understood. He had felt abandoned by a system that trained him for war and then left him to fight the peace alone. He had felt abandoned by friends who didn't understand the shadows in his eyes. And now, this child. Someone had left him here to die. The realization ignited a cold fury in his chest, a fire different from the one in the stove. This was a new mission, one that had begun the moment Wren had detected the boy in the snow. It wasn't just about keeping him alive through the night. It was about finding out who he was and why he was here. It was about justice. As the fire crackled and popped, casting dancing shadows on the log walls, Marcus kept his vigil. He periodically checked the boy's pulse, his breathing, his temperature. I thought it was slow, painstaking work, but after another hour he felt a faint change. The boy's skin was no longer icy to the touch. It was still cold, but there was a suggestion of warmth returning. Then the most beautiful sound Marcus had ever heard cut through the quiet of the cabin. A small, shuddering sigh escaped the boy's lips. It was a sound of life. A few minutes later, the shivering started. It was weak at first, just a slight tremor, but it quickly grew into violent whole-body shakes. Marcus almost smiled. Shivering was the body's way of generating its own heat. It was a sign that the core was warming up, that the internal furnace was kicking back on. It was painful to watch, but it was a victory. He moved closer, placing a steadying hand on the boy's shoulder through the sleeping bag. "It's okay," he murmured, his voice soft. "You're safe. Just let it happen." The shivering continued for a long time, rattling the boy's small frame. Wren, ever the empath, began to lick the boy's hand where it rested near the edge of the bag, a gentle, rhythmic reassurance. Outside, the blizzard continued its assault, but inside the small cabin, a different kind of storm was brewing. A storm of survival, of questions, and of an unlikely bond forged in the deepest cold. The boy was alive, and for now, that was enough. But as the first hints of dawn began to lighten the snow-covered windows, Marcus knew that the true test was only just beginning. The boy would wake up, and when he did, he would have to face the terrifying reality of how he came to be lost in the woods, and Marcus would have to face the decision of what to do next. But the first gray light of dawn painted the snow-covered windows of the cabin a soft, ethereal white. The fire in the wood stove had burned down to a bed of glowing embers, casting a warm, ruddy glow across the room. Marcus hadn't slept. He sat in the same chair, his body stiff and aching, his eyes gritty with exhaustion. He had watched over the boy all night, monitoring his breathing, feeling his forehead, witnessing the violent shivering that had gradually subsided into a deep restorative sleep. Wren had finally succumbed to his own fatigue, curling up at the foot of the sleeping bag, his nose tucked under his tail. The silence in the cabin was profound, broken only by the occasional settling of a log in the stove and the soft whisper of snow against the window. Then a new sound emerged, a small, frightened whimper. Marcus was on his feet instantly, crossing to the boy's side in 2 silent strides. The boy's face was scrunched up, his eyes moving rapidly beneath his closed lids. He was dreaming, and it wasn't a pleasant dream. His small body twitched, and another whimper escaped him. Wren lifted his head, ears perked, his own sleep interrupted. Marcus knelt down. He didn't touch him, not wanting to startle him. He just spoke, his voice a low, calming rumble. "Hey there, it's all right. You're safe. You're in a warm place." The boy's eyes flew open. They were a startling shade of blue, wide with terror. For a moment, they were unfocused, seeing only the remnants of his nightmare. Then they landed on Marcus's face, and the terror intensified. He tried to scramble backward, but the sleeping bag restrained him, making him panic even more. He let out a sharp cry. Marcus immediately backed away, raising his hands in a universal gesture of peace. "Whoa, whoa, easy," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "It's okay. My name is Marcus. You're safe. You were lost in the snow. My dog Wren, he found you." At the sound of his name, Wren's tail gave a tentative thump against the floor. He inched his head forward, his dark eyes soft and curious. The boy's gaze flickered from Marcus's imposing figure to the dog. The terror in his eyes slowly began to morph into a wary confusion. He stared at Wren, and Wren stared back, his whole body wiggling with the effort of staying still. He gave a soft, questioning whine. The sound seemed to be the key that unlocked something in the boy. His lower lip trembled. He looked around the cabin, at the strange walls, the fire, the big man, and the dog. Then he looked down at his own body, dwarfed by the large thermal shirt and bundled in the sleeping bag. Then, as the full weight of his situation, or at least the part he could remember, crashed down on him, his face crumpled, and he began to cry. It wasn't a loud, wailing cry. It was a quiet, hopeless sobbing, the kind that comes from a place of deep exhaustion and utter despair. Marcus felt his heart clench. He didn't know what to do with a crying child. He knew how to treat a gunshot wound, how to call in a medevac, how to lead men into combat, but this was a different kind of warfare. He looked helplessly at Wren, who had already solved the problem. The Malinois had crept closer and was now gently licking the tears from the boy's cheek, his tail wagging slowly. The boy, startled by the warm, wet tongue, and hiccuped and looked at the dog. Wren licked him again, this time on the nose. A tiny wet sniffle escaped the boy, and the crying subsided into shuddering breaths. Marcus saw his opening. He moved slowly to the small wood-burning stove, lifted the kettle, and poured some hot water into a metal mug. He dropped in a tea bag he'd had for years, let it steep, and then added a generous dollop of honey from a bear-shaped container. He brought the mug over and set it on the floor a few feet from the boy. "You must be thirsty," he said, not pushing. "This will help warm you up from the inside. It's just tea. Sweet." The boy looked at the mug, then back at Marcus. His eyes, still wet with tears, were wary, but the primal fear was gone. He slowly, carefully, extended a small hand from the sleeping bag and wrapped it around the warm mug. He didn't drink it, just held it, absorbing the warmth. His other hand came out and tentatively touched Wren's head. Wren leaned into the touch, his eyes closing in bliss. The boy's fingers combed through the thick fur, a simple, grounding action. For a long time, they just sat there. The boy sipping his tea, Marcus sitting in his chair, Wren being a living, breathing comfort. The storm outside had finally broken. The wind had died, and a weak, watery sun was trying to pierce the clouds, reflecting off the fresh snow and casting a brilliant, almost painful light into the cabin. Finally, Marcus broke the silence. "My name is Marcus," he repeated softly. "What's your name?" The boy looked up at him. His voice, when it came, was a hoarse, barely there whisper. "Leo." "Leo," Marcus repeated, nodding. "That's a good, strong name. It's nice to meet you, Leo. This troublemaker here is Wren." Wren's tail thumped harder at the sound of his name. Leo's lips almost twitched into a tiny smile. He looked back at Marcus, the question that had been burning in his eyes finally finding a voice. "Where am I? How did I get here?" It was the question Marcus had been dreading. He chose his words carefully. "You're in my cabin, deep in the woods. Wren and I found you last night, in the snow, during the blizzard. You were very cold. Do you remember anything about how you got there?" Leo's brow furrowed. He stared into his mug, his small face a canvas of concentration and pain. I was in a car," he said slowly, the memories coming back in fragments. "It was loud. My dad. He was driving. He was yelling. He's always yelling." He paused, his grip on the mug tightening. He stopped the car. He made me get out. He said he'd be right back. He said he was just going to get help. A fresh tear slid down his cheek. He told me to wait by a big tree. I waited and waited. It got dark and cold. I tried to find the road, but I just got more lost. I was so tired. I just wanted to sleep. Marcus felt the cold fury from the night before return, but he kept his face impassive. He had heard stories of human depravity in his years of service, but this was a special kind of cruelty. Leaving a child, his own child, in the middle of a forest as a storm was brewing. It was a death sentence. "You were very brave, Leo," Marcus said, his voice thick. "You did the right thing by trying to find help. But you got lost, and that's not your fault. The important thing is, you're safe now." "Is my dad coming back?" Leo asked, his voice small and filled with a heartbreaking sliver of hope. Marcus looked at the boy. He saw the fear and the desperate need for it not to be true. He couldn't lie to him. He was a SEAL. He dealt in hard truths. "I don't think so, Leo," he said as gently as he could. "I think you're going to be staying here with me for a while." Leo's face crumbled for a second. Then he looked at Ren, who was now resting his head on Leo's knee, gazing up at him with utter devotion. The dog didn't care about the boy's past or his father. He only cared that he was here, alive, and within petting distance. Leo's small hand found its way back to Ren's ear, and he held on tight, as if the dog were an anchor in a stormy sea. The next few days took on a strange, quiet rhythm. Marcus, a man of action and solitude, found his world suddenly expanded to include a small, silent boy. He cooked simple meals, soup, oatmeal, eggs from his small chicken coop, and Leo ate mechanically, saying little. He slept a lot, his small body still recovering from its ordeal. Ren rarely left his side, becoming a silent, furry shadow. When Leo sat on the floor, staring into the fire, Ren would sit with him, pressing his warm body against the boy's side. When Leo lay on the bed, exhausted, Ren would jump up and curl at his feet. Marcus watched them, a strange feeling settling in his chest. It was a feeling he hadn't experienced in a long time. It felt like purpose. Not the purpose of a mission or an operation, but something more fundamental. He was protecting someone. He was keeping someone safe. The silence of the cabin, but once a heavy blanket he wore to shut out the world, was now filled with the soft sounds of another presence. The whisper of pages turning as Leo looked at an old book, the quiet murmur of the boy talking to Ren, the soft pad of his feet on the wooden floor. On the third day, the weather cleared completely. The sun was brilliant, turning the snow into a dazzling field of diamonds. Marcus knew he had a decision to make. There was no phone in the cabin. The nearest town was a long trek out. He had to report this. He had to find out what had happened to Leo's father. He looked at the boy who was sitting on the porch with Ren, throwing a stick for the dog to fetch in the snow. The boy was laughing, a real bright sound that echoed in the crisp air. It was the first time Marcus had heard him laugh. He watched as Ren bounded through the deep snow, his whole body a picture of joy, and dropped the stick at Leo's feet, tail wagging furiously. The thought of disrupting this fragile peace, of handing Leo over to a system of strangers and social workers, filled Marcus with a deep unease. He had been failed by systems. He knew how cold and impersonal they could be, but he also knew he couldn't just keep a lost child. It wasn't right. It wasn't legal. He walked out onto the porch. Leo looked up at him, his blue eyes no longer filled with terror, but with a cautious trust. "Leo," Marcus said, his voice serious, "we need to go into town tomorrow. We need to find out what happened to your dad, and we need to let people know you're safe." Leo's smile faded. He looked down at Ren, who had come to stand by his side. "Will Ren come?" he asked. Ren will always come," Marcus promised. The drive into the small town of Oak Creek was surreal. Leo sat in the passenger seat of Marcus's old pickup truck, Ren in the jump seat behind them, his head poking between them. Leo stared out the window at the world he had almost left forever, a world of snow-covered fields and small, neat houses. Marcus's mind was a whirlwind of scenarios. He'd called the sheriff's department from a gas station phone, his story brief and to the point. The sheriff's office was a small, squat building. They were met by a kind-faced woman named Sheriff Delgado. She looked at Leo with a mixture of professional concern and genuine compassion. She took them into a private room, gave Leo a juice box and a granola bar, and began to ask gentle questions. Marcus sat beside Leo, a silent, solid presence, and while Wren lay at Leo's feet under the table. Leo told his story again, his voice steadier this time. He gave his full name, Leo's last name, and described his father's car. Sheriff Delgado listened intently, her face growing more serious with every word. When Leo was done, she excused herself. Through the thin walls, they could hear the murmur of her voice on the phone. When she returned, her expression was grave. She looked at Marcus, then knelt in front of Leo. "Leo," she said softly, "we found your father's car. It was abandoned about 20 miles from where you were found, on a different forest road." Leo's eyes widened. "Is he okay?" Sheriff Delgado hesitated for a fraction of a second. It was a tiny tell, but Marcus caught it. "He's not in the car, sweetheart. We're still looking for him. The important thing is that you're safe. We've contacted your mother." Leo looked confused. "My mom? She doesn't live with us." "We know," the sheriff said gently. "She lives in another state. She's been looking for you for days. She didn't know your father had taken you. She's on her way here. She's flying in tonight." The news hit Leo like a physical blow. His mother, a figure from a distant, happier past, was coming for him. It was a flood of conflicting emotions, hope, confusion, and a deep, abiding sadness for the father who had left him in the cold. As Sheriff Delgado made arrangements for Leo, Marcus stood to leave. This was where his part of the mission ended. He had delivered the package to friendly hands. He walked to the door, Wren at his heel. He didn't look back. "Marcus?" It was Leo's small voice. Marcus turned. The boy was standing by the table, his small frame looking even smaller in the sterile office. "Will I see you again? Will I see Wren?" Marcus looked at the boy, at the bond they had forged in the crucible of the storm. He looked at Wren, whose ears were pricked forward, his tail giving a slow, hopeful wag as he looked at Leo. Marcus thought of the quiet cabin, the long, silent nights, and the strange, new feeling of warmth that Leo had brought with him. He thought of the rules, the systems, the way the world was supposed to work. He thought of a small boy, abandoned to the cold, and a dog who had refused to let him die. He knelt down, so he was at Leo's eye level. "You will, Leo," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he couldn't name. "You will." It wasn't a promise made lightly. It was a vow. For in saving Leo, the boy and his dog had unwittingly saved something in Marcus, too. A part of him he thought had been frozen solid long ago. And some bonds, once forged in the heart of a blizzard, are not so easily broken.